Hey everybody, thanks for watching. When I woke up this morning and checked the date, I sort of reflexively do that in the morning, make sure I have that right. I was just instantly reminded of the meteorological and national anniversary that we're happening upon here at the end of this week. 20 years ago today, August 28th, we were watching Hurricane Katrina reach Category 5 strength in the Gulf of Mexico before turning north and unfortunately bearing down on New Orleans that next day, which would be the 29th tomorrow. So tomorrow is the anniversary of the landfall itself, but the radar loop I'm showing you here was that storm coming into view of that radar in southeast Louisiana. This is just about the absolute worst thing that we want to see as meteorologists, a strong major hurricane bearing down on a low-lying population center. This is just what we worry about every August, and we saw it 20 years ago, unfortunately, and all the death and destruction, frankly, that followed. It did weaken to a Category 3 at landfall, but it was really semantics. It still had much of the inertia and the weight of a Category 5 with respect to its storm surge, which ended up being probably the most destructive aspect of the storm, but still the wind in Mississippi. I mean, this storm is going to be remembered, unfortunately, for a very long time. Play this loop overhead. That was the radar loop. We do have satellite loops from NOAA. The satellite quality wasn't quite as good back then. You can see the storm hitting southern Florida. Got its act together, unfortunately, very quickly as it got into the middle of the very warm Gulf of Mexico that year in 2005, which was just an incredible year for the Atlantic hurricane season before ultimately making landfall there on the Gulf Coast and swinging up inland before weakening. Now, fortunately, if I were to jump over and show us the current kind of satellite view of the Atlantic, well, the good news is this August 28th, 20 years later, the Atlantic could not be more quiet for what really is the peak of the season. I think of late August, early September as being the absolute peak of our hurricane season in the Atlantic, where so many anniversaries really for hurricanes fall around this time. I can think of Laura in southwest Louisiana more recently, came through this week a few years ago. So it's good to not see any disturbances of note here. I mean, maybe this little wave down here in the central Atlantic, but it's a little bit too far south. It's almost kind of on a beeline towards South America. This is a wave that looked a little bit more impressive coming off Africa yesterday, one of these African easterly waves or AEWs that we watch, but not seeing much here this morning. So I think we continue with this quiet stretch for another week or two before maybe mid-September this starts to perk up again, and we'll have more to watch in the Atlantic. A few more things to look at here at home across the continental U.S. Frankly, with the monsoon quieting down just a little bit from earlier this week when it was very active and some of this rain in the southern plains, it's been pretty quiet weather-wise. And we do see this rain moving through the southern plains. It's kind of interesting. Whenever we see the monsoon pick up in intensity, really the kind of flow, we talked about this on Tuesday, but you need one of these kind of ridges to build up into the western U.S. to build that heat into the Intermountain West. That helps pull up some of this moisture both out of the Pacific. And then the Gulf provides a lot of the moisture, surprisingly, for the monsoon, despite being a little bit further away. So that tends to pull up moisture like this toward the southwest or the Intermountain West from the Gulf. You have that ridging atop it. And then, we've mentioned this before, what goes up tends to come down in the atmosphere. So you tend to have a trough here in the eastern U.S. when this occurs. We can see that now. You see the flow of these showers coming across the Great Lakes, bringing some light shower activity in northern Illinois, northwest Indiana. And it kind of meets, the flow coming up out of the Gulf meets that trough coming down somewhere in this corridor here. So curiously, this time of year when we get heightened monsoon activity, we sometimes get these corridors, curiously, of precipitation that kind of unzips along this line through the Gulf Coast. We're seeing that this week, which is good because this area needs some of the rain. They've gone over dry this summer despite the earlier flooding in 2025. The reason for that is the low-level flow is just bringing a ton of low-level moisture right into the central and the southern plains here, Kansas and Oklahoma, into Arkansas. It is not hard to find this southerly flow just screaming into this little boundary here. That's kind of what I meant. You have this flow out of the southeast from the Gulf, and then it meets that trough coming down, and that intersection point right along here is where we're expecting continued rainfall today and where we've seen it this week. Eric mentioned yesterday we are watching really kind of the remnants at this time of Tropical Storm. I think it's still Tropical Storm Juliet, but it's lost a lot of that thunderstorm activity. It is bringing some upper level moisture that's flowing over Southern California, Southwest Arizona. It's unclear if it's even making it to the ground, but we are seeing some radar returns, at least some light ones start to pop up in that area here. Let's see if we can jump back and show you. There's some of that Juliet moisture trying to get over the lower Colorado River Valley. A lot of the low-lying or near to the ground air here, as you'd imagine, over the desert is dry, and a lot of this kind of light returns of radar tends to evaporate before making it to the ground here, but can't rule out some of this getting some precipitation back into this area here today. Otherwise, kind of keeping an eye on this corridor here for additional rainfall here today. I'm going to zoom in right, there's that flow coming up out of the south very quickly. It's colliding with this little front here. And we've seen plenty of rain, flash flood watches, flood advisories, and warnings in this corridor here. Saw some rain yesterday through Arkansas, more here this morning. And this is, I mentioned this, it's needed. This corridor here in the lower Mississippi River Valley has been dry over the last 60 days. This isn't like a 15 or 20 day flash drought. These are 2 to 3 inch rainfall deficits over, what amounts to the entire summer here, which is interesting because if I painted the one area we were talking about excessive flooding, remember in April, it was like this corridor here, right up through the Ohio River Valley. I showed you a picture of, Great American and Cincinnati flooding. And man, this has been an impressive flip over to dry, which we mentioned this area of the country has that tendency to flip hard from one regime to the other. And unfortunately, we've seen that this year. Other kind of big picture things that we've been kind of keeping an eye on this year is the, we'll call maybe the Far Eastern Corn Belt or the New England drought. You can see those deficits there over the last 60 days. And what was a slow to start or weak monsoon this year has started to walk back a little bit closer to normal here. So good to see Arizona, Nevada, Utah getting some of this monsoon rainfall. Idaho seen quite a bit here in the last kind of 4 to 5 days. Jump over and just look at the soil moisture deficits in late August here. Again, this corridor here right along the delta needing some of the rainfall that they're expected to get. We saw some yesterday, more coming today, fortunately, especially for kind of the lower half of this area that I'm drawing here, maybe kind of like down into here is going to see more of that rainfall. We can still see some of this deficits lingering around the central U.S. from earlier in the year where we didn't see quite as much moisture. If we just look at the last 30 days of precipitation, we get something more of that recent dryness, and it really highlights some of these other areas here, not just the lower Mississippi River Valley, but even up into Missouri, southern and southwest Illinois, reports of significant dryness there, southern Ohio, West Virginia, parts of Pennsylvania. I mean, even beyond some of those longer-term drought risk areas, these are areas that have gone over bone dry just recently here in August. If we look at the last 24 hours of rainfall, that monsoon has started to push toward the northeast a bit, just overall across the southwest. So Idaho, we mentioned those rains getting into there, portions of eastern Washington, western Montana, some showers percolating through that half of the state here this morning. And then this corridor that we mentioned, right through Kansas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas is going to be pushing further to the southeast here as we go through the day today. Before we jump into that forecast, I do want to jump over some of the monsoon activity right in California. Eric talked about those thunderstorms along the Sierra Nevada. We did see an uptick, surprisingly, in the Garnet Fire. This is just east of Fresno, California. I'll play this loop here. Here's the Fresno metro, those darker colors there. And look at the Garnet Fire burning east up into the mountains of the Sierras there. It's impressive to see it on this overnight fire product. You can see it burning there. I know it's going to be hard to see on the screen. There's this little orange hot spot. We use these satellites to look for those infrared signatures for those very hot fires, and that allows us to see them maybe a little bit sooner than even that smoke plume goes up. You can kind of see that hot spot showed up well before that smoke plume showed up. That can give you like a 15, 30 minute or even 45 minute head start on finding some of these before the reports start coming in of those big smoke plumes. But we saw one of those yesterday for the fire here. This is from the UC San Diego, just helicopter shots of that pyrocumulonimbus cloud. What's always kind of cool about these images is not the fire burning underneath, but if you can see the smoke plume, it reaches what we call the LCL, or the lifted condensation level, and that's where the smoke and the rising air here starts to condense into water droplets, which a lot of the smoke stays in here, but the white kind of colored cloud that you can see above it is a proper cloud. It's a proper, has water in it, along with a lot of smoke. And these can cause thunderstorms. We can even see tornadoes come out of these at times in rare instances, and impressive to see these helicopter shots. And again, it's kind of easy to see that lifted condensation level where there's often like a little inversion associated with it. And so you can see some of the smoke spreading out along that level. And that's that color difference between the top of the pyrocumulus and the smoke below it. If we look at the NOAA All Hazards map here this morning, like I said, fairly quiet. Beyond that southern plains rainfall, the monsoon's starting to tamp down a little bit, and we see those flash flood watches for northern Oklahoma, southern Kansas, far northwest Arkansas, southwest Missouri, some flood advisories and warnings kind of intermixed underneath some of that heaviest rainfall here. If I jump over and show you the 3-kilometer NAM, let me see if I can zoom that in a little bit more. We'll start this forecast. Let's do 6 a.m. here, Central Time. See those showers that we just talked about? That matches pretty close to that signature we just saw on radar. But pushing further toward the southeast across the Mississippi River here today. This takes us through lunchtime, getting through Little Rock, Fayetteville. Now we're at 6 p.m. this afternoon and evening, taking us to overnight. You can see this coverage increasing further south in Arkansas, further in central and southern Mississippi. Toward Jackson, this is now overnight. Let's see if we can get back here. We'll take it a little bit further out. Just some showers here along the northern plains, upper Midwest, nothing significant. And then all the way through now, getting into Alabama, northern Louisiana. This is tomorrow morning on Friday. So nice healthy dose of moisture over the next 48 hours for this quarter here that has gone over dry this summer despite earlier rains. If we look at big picture, the upper level winds, Eric talked about this yesterday. There's that Bering Sea trough. It's inching a little bit further east in the last 24 hours, but we still have this trough that's dominating across the eastern U.S. We have this ridge that's really been building up over Canada here and some kind of a trough underneath it. This kind of ridge atop a trough, that's that blocking pattern we're going to start to see take shape this weekend. And then some flows, trying to get back. There's Tropical Storm Juliet, trying to push some flow back into the southwest. Some of the cloud cover here, the fact that this ridge is building more up into Canada than it is over like Salt Lake City has allowed temperatures to cool a little bit off the west, where we had the heat just a few days ago. So if we look at those maximum temperatures here forecasted, let's make this valid for today on Thursday from the National Weather Service. You can see colder temperatures relative to average for much of the continental U.S., save for parts of maybe Texas and North Dakota and Oregon here. But even through California, Nevada, Utah, and then all the way underneath that heavy rain that we're seeing across Kansas into Arkansas today, as you'd imagine, all that cloud cover and precipitation keeping temperatures cooler there relative to late August, but then a wide area of the eastern U.S. seeing those cooler temperatures. That trough's going to continue to dominate. We talked about this kind of persistent cool pattern, so I'm taking this forecast into Saturday, Sunday. I'm doing it quickly because we don't see any kind of significant temperature change except for maybe some increased heat in Washington. This is Tuesday of next week, now Wednesday. And we're actually likely to see Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of next week another one of these cooler shots of air where we're starting to warm up a little bit here. Parts of New England, parts of the Midwest, Ohio River Valley, getting back up into the 80s. Remember those in parts of Illinois and Missouri, maybe even 90 toward Memphis. But I think this cool shot is going to come in and knock that attempt to bring heat back in here back down as we go further into next week. The reason for that, let's jump over and look at that 500 millibar height forecast from the ECMWF, make this valid. There's that trough that we talked about, that increasing the strength of that West Canadian ridge. Less of that ridge parked directly over the western U.S., a little trough underneath that. I'm going to take this forecast forward. And there's that blocking pattern that we talked about. There's that omega block where you have the two troughs flanking the upper level ridge. You can see I'm drawing that Greek letter omega. Where these tend to develop, they tend to park themselves for a long time. And you'll see as that gets itself situated there across the western U.S., it allows more troughs to both remain across the eastern U.S. and then even dig in. So this is the one we're watching Tuesday. This is, if we're in the upper Midwest, maybe the Ohio River Valley, the eastern Corn Belt, this is the weather maker we're watching next week. As that swings through. Remember on Wednesday, we saw the National Weather Service bring down those high temperatures considerably in the upper Midwest, northern plains. It's that trough bringing another one of these cold fronts through. That settles in later in the week, Thursday, Friday. We're all the way out to September 4th now to the 5th. And this is going to bring some seriously cooler temperatures for early September for that corridor here. And still seeing this ridging in the North Pacific, maybe even, late next week, another one of these troughs moving through this direction here. It's getting a little bit out in the forecast here. So if I take this ECMWF precip forecast out, take it quickly. There's the rainfall we're expecting today. This is through Thursday. See some shower activity trying to form in the northern and central plains here as we go through Saturday. By and large, pretty quiet across the continental U.S., but there's that system Tuesday to Wednesday of next week, September 3rd and 4th, that low pressure system associated with it. Maybe over Lake Superior here, there's that cold front trying to bring showers all the way back through here toward the Panhandle region of Texas and Oklahoma, through Illinois, into Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. Quickly moves through the Ohio River Valley, eastern Corn Belt, down into the Gulf Coast states. This is Thursday the 4th before making its way through New England. This is a quick shot of precipitation chances in the middle of next week. So you're not going to see this kind of widespread, heavy rainfall signature when we look at some of the anomalies later. But it is a chance. And under what's been a pretty dry regime across a wide area here, save for the southern plains, right? It's something to watch in the forecast next week. Now, temperature-wise, we're going to be on the cooler side with that trough kind of dominating. If we look at our three panels of temperature here, this is the ECMWF, the GFS ensemble, and the AAFS. Next 5 days, right? That heat dominating over Canada. We try to build some, more seasonable temperatures back into the Midwest, but, not seeing a ton of that signature in the models. And then next week, 5 to 10 day forecast really takes us through the next work week. And we see, cool temperatures dominating in the central and eastern U.S., warm temperatures out west, Oregon, Washington, California, heat returning to those states. And then even in the long range, we talked about that block in the atmosphere, that tendency to persist the current pattern. The AFS, which we've been watching a little bit in that 10 to 15 day time range for its better performance, cooler all the way from the northern plains, even the Canadian prairie now, through the southern plains all the way over to the Atlantic coast, and then warmer in the western U.S. With that block out here in the North Pacific, it's going to be hard-pressed to find something to change and break up this atmosphere, the persistence that we've seen. If we look at the ECMWF and take the forecast all the way out, the only thing we really see is that the block starts to move maybe a little bit further west over Alaska, and that allows some ridging to build back into the east coast. Maybe we can bring heat back in this way, especially to portions of the Metro East, New England, the Carolina coastline. If we get the AFS, I'm just taking it really far out very quickly just to get a hint at where we might be going. And there's those troughs that move through late next week, but then into the week after, again, starting to see some ridging build back into the eastern U.S. So that's at least something to watch, but we're way on to the forecast here, 10 to 15 days at this point. What we also might be seeing is the MJO. It's finally making this return that we've talked about, this kind of quick return from phases 3 and 4 in the forecast. And by the point where we get into the latter, maybe the kind of first and second week of September, getting back over into phase 1 or 2. And when we've looked at the analogs, let's do like phase 1 in the forecast from the middle part of September. Well, this is September 8th. We still see that troughing over the central U.S., see that ridging out west. That coincides with kind of that 10 to 15 day forecast. But notice New England. We start to see ridging building here over the Canadian Maritimes. Talked about this on Tuesday a little bit. So maybe we start to push in some heat east to west across the continental U.S. If we last from phase 1 into the middle part of September, you can see that trough here weakening across the central U.S., and this ridge here continues to spread its influence further. If we jump into like phase 2 in the middle part of September, you can see that ridging now starting to develop across the southeast. Still see some troughing here. This is likely still bring a lot of moisture into the central part of the country. Likely precipitation in this quarter here, some cooler temperatures, but more heat building in maybe even the Midwest and East at this point, but staying hot over in the western U.S. Kind of putting this together in a long-range forecast right now, absent of any other signal, any other major little typhoon coming through and breaking this up. Right, continued to stay warm in the western U.S. That seems to be a persistent signal despite this relative cool down this week. But if we're going to build heat back into the eastern U.S., it might start in New England or the Atlantic coastline and move east to west. And then the precipitation as this occurs would pick up in this quarter that's gone over dry in the last few days here. But again, you'd be hard-pressed in the long-range forecast. I didn't even show the precipitation anomalies too early because it's dry through the same quarter that we've talked about all the way through the Canadian prairie toward the eastern U.S. We have that system moving through next week, and you can see kind of the weak precipitation signatures associated with that, hoping to get some rain into here at Ohio and West Virginia as that front moves through, especially as it pushes up some of the elevation here on the backside. But that's about it, in terms of material long-range precip to look at in the 10-day forecast. And if we take this 4 to 10 days, rather than looking just at the whole 0 to 10 days, it removes what we're expecting here over the next 48 hours and see how dry this area is here. So perhaps changing in the middle part of September if we get that MJO turning around as we expect. ECMWF extended forecast. This is that long-range forecast from the European model. Eric talked on this yesterday. It continues that drier signal through the kind of much of September. This takes us from September 1st through October 1st. And, waiting to see if that MJO is going to help to bring some moisture back up into this part of the country. We'll see phase 1 and 2 looked at least a little bit more favorable for that. Otherwise, again, touched on the Atlantic earlier. That continues to look quiet. I think if we get into phase 1 or 2 by middle part of September, that will change. This map will start to lighten up a little bit with more colors and more systems to watch. So we're kind of waiting on that. If I jump over and show you the continental U.S. view, there's that tropical storm Juliet, the moisture that's pluming up into Southern California, helping bring some of those temperatures down there. Otherwise, big picture, looking across the sea surface temperatures across the globe. Just a few things to keep an eye on here. The Indian Ocean dipole maybe weakening a little bit in its negative phase with some ocean temperatures cooling in the East Indian Ocean versus warming in the West. And then really the kind of the big story here is over the last 7 days, this is temperature change of the sea surface temperatures over the last 7 days. You can see in the Central Pacific that the trend is colder on the bluer side of the color bar in the Central Pacific. And so La Nina continues to strengthen through the last 7 days, continues really to strengthen over the last 30 to 45 days. So continuing to become the dominant probability for our INSO state this winter. Continue to monitor that story. And then there's Hurricane Aaron's shadow of those cooler temperatures from all the wind and the rain that it brought to the western Atlantic here. And you can see that track very nicely here. And Eric mentioned those trade winds through the southern Caribbean, those strong trade winds here. We can kind of follow these all the way up into the precipitation that's falling here over Oklahoma and Kansas and Arkansas. They've helped to stir up the waters here in the deep Caribbean, cool the waters off there, so connecting that as well. I'll finish this up here on August 28th with one more map. This is the sea surface temperature anomalies, not looking at the 7-day change, just absolutely. And we're referencing the anomaly against the global mean. So this gives us a different perspective of how cool are the waters in the Central Pacific relative to all the other current sea surface temperatures in the globe. And the answer is very cool. So at least relative to the global mean, we are in what looks like a pretty obvious La Nina right now. And there's all that North Pacific warmth that we've talked about. Japan hitting a country record for high temperature this summer with all that warm water around it. But we certainly look to be in a La Nina signature here going forward. We will see if the Climate Prediction Center names it as such going through September or October. But there's implications there in the forecast, obviously for winter and then maybe even the growing season for 2026. We'll talk about that when we get to it. As for today, thanks for watching.